Hey, Life Group leaders. This week we are once again in Proverbs chapter 3. So it's chapter 3, part 2, I guess you'd say. And as we jump in, the book of Proverbs is probably going to be the best manual you could find on people skills because it was given to us by God, who made people who can teach us what we need to know about human relationships, whether that's marriage or family or our neighbors or our job or just a wide circle of friends and acquaintances. If we learn and practice God's wisdom as it's presented in Proverbs, we'll find ourselves improving in people skills and enjoying life much more. And last week we talked about how it would be dangerous to read Proverbs and miss going to the cross. And I'm going to double down on that thought this week, lest our study of Proverbs devolve into a do this, don't do that sort of lecture, or even worse, it's just a detached view of poetic devices found in concentrations of ancient Hebrew morality text. Yeah, I always try to find the story in the biblical passage, and while there isn't really one here, I think that the point of our text today points to the story of Jesus, and so I'm going to go back and forth between our text and Christ. So we're going to start right before our assigned text, and we're going to look at our context in 19 and 20. And let me paraphrase what those two verses say. My son, and remember in chapters 1 through 8, it reads as a father pleading with their child to embrace wisdom. So it will say, my son, don't lose sight of God's wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Rather, hang on to these, that you might exercise sound judgment and discretion as you make your way through life. As you do so, you will be godly, and lots of good will flow from this. In fact, godliness will grace your life as a beautiful necklace graces the one wearing it. My son, wear wisdom well. And so, if you translate that into the New Testament language, what he's really pleading with the son to do is to put on Christ. And you can see that from Romans and Galatians and Colossians. As New Testament believers, we're to put Christ, his character, on over us and keep him on. And when we do, we will manifest his attractive qualities, his grace. And in our text, as we'll see, there are 8 identifiable qualities that will manifest if we cling to sound wisdom and discernment. So this is one way that I would approach the text this week, to look at the comparison of the qualities of wisdom and the characteristics of Christ. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 3, it says, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, referring to Jesus. And as Pastor J.A. Metters says, wisdom is a who more than a what. Jesus is wisdom. He is the Proverbs wrapped in flesh. They're animated and fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth. Remember that as we read, and I'll try to remind us of specific gospel passages that illustrate this point. And if you're a theme person, I would say the general theme of 21 through 35 is having good social relationships. In verses 21 through 35, we can see the quality of love in the wise son. The father, in the beginning, pleads with the son to embrace the qualities that are valuable. Don't let them out of your sight. Keep them in your heart. And what we see here is that it's not enough to know the truth, but it has to be kept. A proverb about a proverb would be actions speak louder than words. And the first Christ-like quality I want us to look at here is that Jesus was bold and beautiful. He says, my son, don't lose sight of these. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. There will be life to your soul and adornment on your neck, and you will walk away securely, and your foot will not stumble. As noted, we have to hold fast to get divinely given wisdom. But when we do, we'll live a life that is attractive. It will be like an adornment around our neck. It will promote a life of beauty, a life that is increasingly like our Lord, and will be resourceful and able to fruitfully face any of the challenges of life. And we're to cling to wisdom as if we would a precious stone. Gold, silver, and jewels may be beautiful, but wisdom is more beautiful than any of these valuable objects. But wisdom will also give us boldness. We will walk securely and not stumble, which are concepts that speak to boldness. And as Old Testament professor Dillard Longman says, wise character creates a safe environment, which breeds confidence. The boldness that we are speaking of is not belligerence. Remember, wisdom, the character of wisdom is beautiful, but rather it's a confident trust, like Jesus in the face of opposition. He prayed the forgiveness of the very people who were crucifying him. They don't know what they're doing, Father. Forgive them. That's what he said in Luke 23. What a bold and beautiful statement. And so moving on to verse 23, which can be lumped all the way to 26, where we learn that unlike silver or gold, which some people would be tempted to take from us, we can hold on to common sense and discernment, and no one can steal them away. They are part of the very essence of who we are. Life is an adventure, and when we have these attributes in our lives, we will be less likely to make the mistakes that would cause us to stumble and fall. We have nothing to fear. Verse 24 gives us special comfort, that we should not be afraid of those things that go bump in the night, because this passage teaches us that God will protect us. And so in verse 24 we learn, like Jesus, that if we follow wisdom, we will be safe and sound. This reminds us of Mark 4, where Jesus is asleep in the boat while the disciples were panicking about the storm. Because he walked in the path of wisdom and trusted his Father, Jesus was able to sleep soundly while others panicked. And so in this section, Solomon begins by praising the value of wisdom. Perhaps now his listeners are listening more attentively because he's given all these positive attributes that wisdom has to offer. He's trying to catch more flies with honey, if you will. He's just trying to get his sons to listen to him, and so he shares all of these positive arguments. But, as you know, sometimes wisdom comes in the form of prohibitions. These are things that wise people don't do. In other words, this is the thou shalt nots. 6, don't do these statements in verse 25. And the first one, if you want to live a wise life, don't be afraid. Then we will be confident and composed like Jesus. Because when Jesus faced his oppressors, he did so with great confidence. You can see that in John 18. And if we wear wisdom well, we can be confident that God is on our side. With this confidence, we can, when faced with adversity, bear them well. And that takes us through verse 26, in which verses 22 through 26 show us the benefits of what 21 tells us to do, preserving sound judgment and having discernment. And those things that we can see are life, in verse 22. We'll have safety, in verse 23. We'll have the avoidance of trouble, also in verse 23. In verse 24, we will have peaceful sleep. Verse 25, we'll have no fear when the wicked come. And in verse 26, we'll have confidence in the future, and we will avoid the traps of the wicked. Those are great things. Why wouldn't you want those things? They will become a part of the life of the one who esteems the wisdom of God above the thoughts of men. Which that then brings us to verses 27 through 30. And these verses really deal with being a good neighbor. The value of wisdom can be seen in what it does with our relationships with other people. So in these verses, we have a clear admonition to help others when we have the capability of doing so. We shouldn't hold back or delay in helping. In Mark 12, Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than this one," and the one he gave before it. As with the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, we see that our neighbor is anyone that we come across who may need our help. Wisdom is found in being a good neighbor. Second do not statement that's found in Proverbs, which is do not deny doing good, especially when we owe it and we have it. We have an echo of this in James chapter 4, where James tells us that if we know what is good and we don't do it, then that is a sin. And that takes us to verse 28, which is the third do not statement. Do not delay doing good when it's in your power to do so. Too often, delaying is a cover for selfishness. It's a secret hope that whatever the issue is will just go away or it will be forgotten. And the reality is, what Proverbs teaches us in chapter 27, verse 1, is that we may not have another opportunity to help. The moment of today that we have to help may be the only one that we have. And so if we do not delay in doing good, we will be like Jesus, and that we will be honorable and helpful. The father in Proverbs instructs the son that the person who wears the wisdom well will treat his neighbor in a way that, as I said, was honorable and helpful. And we can expand this and say that the wise person is caring and compassionate. The situation that's found in 27 and 28 is one in which somebody owes money, not in which one is in the act of giving charity. The point is, what he's trying to make is pay your debts promptly. The tomorrow that's found here, whether you translate it in Hebrew or in Arabic or in English, they all have this implication of indefinite postponement. Yeah, I'll do that tomorrow. And so when we get to 29 and 30, we see that they are additional illustrations of the truths of 27 and 28, what it means to love someone's neighbor. Which brings us to our next do not statement. Do not statement number 4, do not plan evil, especially against your neighbor. Think well of your neighbor, that he and God might think well of you. And so in doing, we will be like Jesus, being trustworthy and being trusted. The person who wears wisdom well will not take advantage of others. Rather, they will give themselves so that their neighbor will be safe and sound. Biblical wisdom suggests wise people who live together in a community need to be able to trust one another. We ought to be careful to pursue the good of our neighbor. We need to be very careful about what we say. Do you say anything that makes you untrustworthy? And I think we can say that Jesus was a trustworthy neighbor. In Matthew 22, the Pharisees, his enemies, approached Jesus, and they told him, "We know that you are a man of integrity." And so in verses 30 through 32, we see that as believers, we should not be violent or follow the practices of those who are. Instead, we are to be peacemakers. Jesus teaches us this principle in Luke chapter 6. He tells us to love your enemies, do good to them, lend to them without expecting to be repaid. Then your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will be truly acting as a child of the Most High, for he is kind to those who are unthankful and wicked. You must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. And that will take us to our 5th do not statement. Do not accuse without cause, especially when they haven't done any harm. That's in verse 30, but there are reasons found throughout the book of Proverbs. In 17, left unchecked, strife can easily escalate into a worse problem. And in Proverbs 25, strife can easily ruin your own reputation. Leave the vengeance to God and seek to overcome evil with good. And in doing so, being like Jesus, we will be peaceful and peaceable. The person who manifests wisdom is not quarrelsome. She doesn't look for a fight. She's very careful about what she says in social media. Does what you say and do online mark you as a peaceful and peaceable person, or are you argumentative? Our neighbors are watching, and people who are secure in their Father, they don't have any need to win. There's no reason to be argumentative because we know that we've already won. And Jesus was very secure in his identity. In John 8, he says, "You are from beneath, but I am from above. You are of this world, but I am not of this world." And we know from Luke chapter 2 that from at least the age of 12, Jesus was very secure in who he was. That takes us to the end of our reading today in verses 31 through 35, which warn against the temptation to resort to violence when we deal with our neighbors. The 6th and final do not statement here, do not envy those who oppress with violence. Your translation may say, do not envy a man of violence, or don't choose his ways. And what this leads to, what this points to, is the character quality here that we're looking to in Jesus is contentment. Because the presence of Jesus erodes the envy of things. We see this attitude in Jesus that's found in Philippians chapter 2, that he had everything. He was up in heaven, but he didn't consider that something to be held on to, but he let go of it, and he humbled himself, and he came to earth. And when we clothe ourselves in that humility, when we have that humble attitude, then we really demonstrate what humility is. Humility isn't thinking less about yourself. Well, I'm a terrible person, woe is me. Humility is just thinking more and better about others. What can I do to elevate them? When we are content, God collects the upright into his confidence. And really from here you can see that the Lord will bless the upright and the just, the humble and the wise. And these are general statements. Righteous people generally are blessed and are extended mercy. Wicked people are generally cursed and mocked. And if you don't practice these 6 do not principles, Proverbs 3:32 indicates that your actions are detestable to the Lord. And as we finish up here, we see in verse 34 that this verse is quoted twice in the New Testament, once in James chapter 4, and Peter quotes it in chapter 5 of 1 Peter. And I say all that just to say don't miss the truth of this verse because the apostles didn't. The teaching is clear. If we want God's grace, His favor or His blessing on our lives and on our homes, we must get wisdom. We need to put it on and wear it well. Because in verse 34, we see the principle of planting and harvesting are always a force throughout our lives. And there are certain universal principles that God uses to judge His creation. And when we contrast an upright person with an evil person, we'll see that God curses both the evil man and those who live in the evil man's household. The evil man's family suffers because of his actions. And eventually, the individuals who practice evil will reap negative consequences like a harvest. And finally, verse 35 probably means that fools display dishonor because that's what they get for their choices, in the contrast to the wise who get honor. And I remember as I was studying, I remember reading the definition of a fool in Proverbs that really helped clarify what's going on here. Because what it said is a simple person is someone who may be lacking in wisdom, but a fool is a person that despises God's truth and wisdom. And in the end, it's the foolish person that will be put to shame. And so if we do all of these things, we, like Jesus, will be blessed. In Hebrews 1, it echoes the principle of stated in verse 35 in our reading today. And what it says is that Jesus is an heir of all things. In the New Testament, Jesus calls us friends and co-heirs in Christ. Co-heirs of all things? Could such a thing be? I mean, think about that. There's going to be a day coming, believer, where you get to inherit everything. Remember when I said last week that the truth of Proverbs are often fully realized in a future that extends past death? Well, again, that's on display here today. The wise person gets it all. And so in conclusion, I would say Proverbs chapter 3 is full of great wisdom, but it doesn't begin to exhaust the wisdom that God offers, because more of this wisdom will be shared in the discourse that Proverbs 3 is a part of in chapters 4 through 9. And then, even after that, there's even more wisdom that's found in the Proverbs of 10 through 31. But remember, Christ is the ultimate repository or container of wisdom and knowledge. And we know that from Colossians 2:3. To live in wisdom is to imitate the Lord and conform to His divinely created order. In other words, He made the world with rules. And when life is lived by those rules, it's lived at its best and it's most abundant when we follow them. So that wraps up our overview of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 21 through 35. And as always, life group leaders, I want to give you some questions to help you build community with your life group. So these you can ask them at the beginning, you can ask them at the end, you can ask them during. But these are just ways to help build community with your life group. To help you build a community, that's why we ask these questions at the end of every week, along those 3 lines of belong, believe, and become. So our belong questions this week: who was the first person you remembered being friends with? Share about a time when someone demonstrated true friendship to you. Our believe questions: what are some excuses people often give for not helping others in need? How do these compare with the excuses in verses 27 and 28? It's easy to think that we are loving our neighbors if we don't wish them harm and we don't actively do things to hurt them. How does this compare with what Proverbs teaches us in verses 27 through 30? And finally, our become questions. What is one way that you will seek wisdom this week? How will you put it into action? How can we fight the temptation of using people to get ahead? What is one way you could show love to someone who is in need this week? that's our lesson for this week. And I hope that the Lord watches over you and your family. And if you need anything, please let me know. Godspeed.